Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. We're up to week 4 of the Portrait Artist of the Week show on Facebook, brought to you by Sky TV. And what I'm doing is for each portrait I create, with a new sitter every week, what I'm doing is I'm using a different technique each week in the hopes of showing you something that perhaps you haven't seen before and showing you new techniques that you can try yourself. So this week it's painting Judge Rinder, or Rob Rinder, TV celebrity. And unusually for me, I'm starting out without doing any preliminary sketches, and I'm going to be taking a mixed media approach for this painting. But I want to show you in particular, if you're just starting out on portrait painting, I want to give you a few tips on how to get going. So the first thing I'm doing here is drawing the central axis of the head. So in other words, if you imagine a straight line going down the centre of the forehead, down through the nose, down through the centre of the mouth and jaw, then that's the central axis of the head. And I've tipped that line slightly to the left because, as you can see here, the screenshot I'm using, Rob's head is tipped to the left a bit as we're looking at it. What I'm doing next is measuring out just very loosely a rectangle that's approximately 1.5 times as long as it is wide. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the measuring technique in this video because I've done a video on that before, and I'll link that down in the description. But you'll see that using my 9B pencil, what I did was I put in the 2 diagonals, and that's a really quick way to find the centre of a rectangle. And then I dropped in a line going from the left side of the box to the right side of the rectangle, and that's going to be my eye line. And what I'm doing now to give me the shape of the head, I'm simply looking at my reference and I'm thinking which bits of the rectangle would I cut off to approximate the shape of Rob's head. And that's a really quick way to get a well-proportioned head. I've just indicated the neck there, and then having done that, now I can begin to very loosely add the eye sockets, or in this case the brow line, just to get the general expression. And notice those 2 lines are above that horizontal halfway line I've got. I've marked in where the bottom of the nose is approximately, and an approximate position for the mouth. So already it's starting to look a little bit like a human being. Admittedly not much, but a little bit. Now the next step is I've switched to using an Inktense pencil. Now these Inktense pencils are brilliant things. If you haven't used them before and you're just starting out, highly recommend them, and you'll see why in just a second. Now the first thing is what I'm doing here, I'm using the pencil to put in regions of darker tones. So I'm just looking at Rob and thinking, okay, well, he's got areas of shadow under his eyebrows. There's some shadow down the right hand side of his forehead and the rest of his face, under his jaw, and in fact on the left hand side of his head as well. And I'm just roughly indicating where the ears are, the shadow under the nose, under the jaw, and then under the jawbone as well. So under the lower lip is what I should have said before. A quick indication of the shoulder line on both sides. So you can almost think of this as if you're modelling a head out of clay. Take a lump of clay, put a couple of recesses in for the eye sockets, a lump for the nose, stick that on a cylinder to represent the neck, and you'd have something similar to what I've drawn here. Now this is why the Inktense are so good. So I've got a water brush here, but you could use any clean brush that's wet, and you can see that when you run that through the pencil marks, it becomes this wonderful vibrant blue colour. Because obviously I've used a blue pencil. Now there are other water-soluble pencils on the market, obviously, so you could use those. But the cool thing with the Inktense is A, they're very vibrant, and B, when this stuff dries, it then becomes waterproof. So if you're just starting out, it's a really nice, safe, secure way to get used to moving paint around. And then having let it dry, you can then think, okay, what colour do I want to put on top? And feel some reassurance that the work you've done isn't going to go anywhere. You're not going to accidentally move it or lift it off the paper. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm kind of just really enhancing the shading. And if I wanted to, I could leave some areas just as pencil marks, of course. So that's a really nice quick way of getting contrasting textures if that's what you want to go for. But for this particular example, I'm mostly just blending the colour and even extending it beyond where I put it down with the pencil to very quickly establish tone. And I'm using some of that pigment I've picked up on the brush to just roughly mark where Rob's irises are. Okay, so I've changed to a different colour now, and I'm repeating the same technique. So this time I've gone for kind of an orange, and I'm now putting in some mid-tone. Again, I come in with the wet brush, sorry, and spread those pencil marks around, and have fun with experimenting with one transparent colour over another. Now he's wearing a dark t-shirt, so I'm coming with a darker blue than before. And again, I'm using some of that, picking up from the wet pool of colour to enhance the shadows here and there. Now, having let all of that dry, my next tip would be, if you're just starting out, try out watercolour marker pens. All right, and that's what I'm using here. Now, these are great because, as the name implies, it's a marker pen with watercolour paint in. They come with, they're double-ended typically, so I'm using the fine line nib, but on the other end is a brush nib if you want a thicker line. And what I'm doing now is going round my initial drawing and an initial tone work, and I'm looking much more carefully, and I'm drawing in more of the lines on Rob's face, so indicating more clearly where his eyebrow is, where the lower edge of the upper part of his eye socket is, and beginning to indicate things like the eyelids and so on. Now, the reason these markers are so good is they're very controllable. They give you a nice clean line, but again, if you want to move them around a little bit or soften a line where you've made a mistake, then again you can just take a clean wet brush and do a similar trick to the Inktense. But the watercolour does have a different character to the Inktense, so again, a really nice way to explore a different medium, see how you can be expressive, but in kind of a secure environment, like I mentioned before. It's not as challenging as something like oil paint, in my personal opinion. So I'm looking quite carefully at where the iris is placed within the eye, and also the shape of the eye as well. Now, generally speaking, when you draw the ears, the top of the ear will generally line up with the eyebrow, and the bottom of the ear would generally line up with the bottom of the nose. So I work my way around the head and the face, defining my features much more carefully and more precisely this time. But again, I've got that reassurance that if I want to move the watercolour marker or get rid of it, then I can lift off quite a bit with the brush, and that's what I'm starting to do here. I'm starting to just introduce some patches of tone by kind of dragging that wet brush through those lines, those watercolour lines, and teasing the colour in little pools to different areas on the paper. And again, you're going to get a nice translucent patch of colour, so you're going to be able to discover how different colours mix as well. Now, one of the differences, as you saw there, I mean, I did that when the paint was still wet, but with the watercolour, even once it's dry, if you get a damp paper towel, you can lift off a bit of that, usually, With the Inktense, that's not really the case. As I said, once it's down, it's permanent. So the two have slightly different characteristics, but they're both really good ways to get started with colour, because they're really quick and, they're really forgiving as well. So you can see in just a few minutes, we've established the presence of, a pretty realistic head. It's not a huge amount of detail there. It's definitely not photorealistic, but it's a realistic head. We've got a sense of light and dark and tone, and we've also got some warm and cool colours going on as well. So this little squiggle I'm doing along the jawline, I'm just kind of experimenting to see, well, can I get any kind of stubble-like texture, as I go along there. So once again, just like I did with the Inktense, I now move around the whole head and face, gradually refining the lines I've put down in an attempt to achieve a likeness of Rob. And I'm using a burnt umber marker at the moment, and I decided to use that to fill in the irises just loosely, leaving a little highlight area there, but I haven't indicated the pupils or anything. Adding some more detail to the ears and the face, little lines in the brow and along the right hand side of the face where there are regions of shadow or you know, a change in tone. Now I'm coming back in with the Inktense. So again, the watercolor and the Inktense, they work really well because you can start with one, switch to the other, switch back to the first, and alternate between the two with really no problem at all. And you can see how vibrant the colours become as you layer them one upon the other. So I'm gradually intensifying the colour and the tone as I work around the face, still applying the pigment with the pencil and then using the wet brush to bring it to life. So if you're just trying to apply a wash of watercolour with a brush, if you're a beginner, you might struggle to control it a little bit, and that might be a little intimidating. So as I said earlier, putting the colour down with the pencil allows you to have total control, and then you can just kind of move it around a little bit, as much or as little as you like. So I add some more detail to the eyes, some eyelashes and the pupils, line along the mouth, and you can see that the face is starting to come to life and starting to take shape. Now, one of the things you might be thinking is, well, that's all very well, doesn't really look too much like Rob Rinder at the moment, but we're going to come to that in a little bit. So there's my first iteration. Is it a realistic human with life behind the eyes and a bit of emotion? I would say yes. I would like to think that's a pretty good human being. But as I said, it doesn't really look too much like Rob. So this is my next top tip really for portraiture. You've got to be super honest with yourself. So, you know, go and have a biscuit and a cup of tea, go for a walk, a bike ride, whatever, and then come back and be brutally honest about what you've done wrong. And that's what I'm doing here. And what I'm doing is I'm using features on the face to see if they line up with each other. So I was just checking to see where the left-hand side of Rob's neck actually is. And I should have had it directly under the corner of his left eye as we're looking at him. And it wasn't. You can see, so I'm coming in with my blue watercolor marker now. And, you know, I've added an extra bit onto the left-hand side of his neck. And then I've also realised his left shoulder, again as we're looking at it, is way too low. All right, so this happens with portraiture, I would say, probably more than anything else, because the slightest little error in posture or position or size of the features can make, you know, somebody look completely different to the way we, to the way we actually see them. So I'm coming in with the blue because it's a bold colour. So when you correct yourself, you know, don't be tentative about it. Don't mess about. Just sort of say to yourself, I made a mistake here. I've got to correct it. Bang! Put in a nice bold line to correct it. So I also realised the nose was too narrow. So I broadened the nose, especially at the bottom there. And what's interesting with this process is you start to see and notice things you repeatedly do when you make mistakes. So I think on a couple of the previous portraits I made the nose a little too narrow. Now I had the right ear a little too high, left one wasn't too bad. Interestingly, the outline of the face was pretty spot on, I felt. And, you know, I took more care with that, if you remember, with the simple rectangle method, so that worked reasonably well. However, the left eye was too low, so I put in some little marks there to indicate where I'm going to move the eye on the left to. But before I get to that, I just want to look with fresh eyes at my corrections. So I'm coming in now with some pure white acrylic paint, just to kind of obliterate what I did wrong in the first instance, so I can get a much clearer picture of where the painting is going. So that's another really good reason for using Inktense pencil and watercolor marker, is that if you want to work over them afterwards with acrylic, no problem at all. They're absolutely compatible. So that's really, you know, a really good thing as well. Now what I'm doing here is, having marked in the new position of the iris, I'm just blocking in some areas with white to indicate where the new whites of the eye would be. And I'm going to come back in a minute and you know, improve that eye, I hope, rather dramatically. Some other things which were problematic were I've put Rob's mouth almost perfectly symmetric on his face. And in fact, the right-hand side of his mouth should be slightly lower than it is. But we'll come to that in a second. So you can see with my burnt umber watercolor marker, I just blocked in a solid lump for the iris. And I've put in a little highlight now with the acrylic, and I indicated with the Inktense pencils where the lower lid should be, just so I can get a feel for where the correction work is going. But having done that and kind of deciding, okay, I think it's pretty good, I'm now coming in with a flesh tone of acrylic. I'm using interactive acrylics here. I've mixed that up with red, yellow, a little touch of blue, and plenty of white. So it's mostly yellow, some red, a little touch of blue, and plenty of white. And I'm using that to kind of refine the areas all around the face. Now I'm adding some bluey purple shadows and gradually adding another dimension to the painting. So this mixed media approach, where in certain areas you can still see, you know, pencil marks, like on the left side of the cheek, on the jaw, on the neck. Other areas you can still see pure lines of watercolor marker, like the lines in the forehead. And then of course there are areas which are covered with acrylic. So it adds a nice multi-layered effect, lots of different textures and you know, surface qualities to the color we're putting down. So another tip would be, if you're just starting out, feel free to experiment with lots of different media and see how they interact within the same painting. You know, really good fun to do as well. So I continue to work around the head. And what I want to do is I want to make corrections as I see fit. But I don't want to, if I can help it, I don't want to completely, you know, kill or obliterate, cover up what I did right at the very beginning. I want to leave some of it showing through if I can. Now, if I have to cover it all up to get the painting to work, I will. But, you know, ideally, I'd like some of that initial energy, that initial sort of freedom of movement to show through. Now you can see I'm using lots of different colours on Rob's face, and that's another really important tip, is that if you look at human skin, it's nearly always a multitude of colours. It picks up different reflections, and of course the tone of the skin varies across the face anyway, because different parts catch the sun differently, so they perhaps age age in a different way. Perhaps there are freckles, which changes the tone. So there's lots of things to look out for, but the thing is to try and paint what you see. You can enhance that or play it down if you want to, but you're aiming to make a conscious decision with everything you do. And the more you can do that, then, you know, the more you'll be able to control what you get. Now I'm just putting in kind of neutral background mid-tone here, just to see how all of my tonal values are working together, because I found the bright white of the paper background a little distracting. So I'm doing some more work on the eye now, or both eyes in fact, and around the mouth. And here I'm using a flat synthetic brush, which is generally, I find, a really efficient way to work. Unless you're trying to do something very, very small and fiddly, then it's very, very adaptable. So this one's only about half an inch. Sorry, not half an inch, quarter of an inch, 3/8 of an inch wide. And it's just about the perfect size for detailed portrait work when you're working on paper of this size. So this paper is roughly 11 inches by 16 inches, something like that. In the UK we call it A3. I'm not sure what you call it in the States. So you can see what I'm doing now is just gradually looking at the whole face and making little adjustments here and there. So there's the second iteration. So I'll put those up side by side for you, and you can see before and after. So it still doesn't look quite like Rob, but there's definitely been a big improvement. It's heading in the right direction. And I've changed lots of things there, but for the most part, the outline of the head was pretty good. So now what I'm doing is repeating basically the last stage, but coming in with sometimes a smaller round brush. I've adjusted the angle of the mouth. You can see I've lowered the right hand corner of the mouth as we look at it. And I'm paying particular attention now to the eyes. So I'm looking at the eyelids. I'm looking at how the eyelids tuck in to the little folds of flesh up under the eyebrow and all the little creases that occur there. I'm looking at the corners of the eyes and the shapes of the corners of the eyes. I'm looking at the lower eyelids and any wrinkles or bags or shadows under the eyes. I'm looking at how the iris sits within the eye, and I'm looking at how the light catches the iris. So is it just solid brown, highly unlikely, or is it brown with a darker edge? That's much more common. And then within that iris, are there little patches of orange or green where they're catching the light? And doing this, is quite time consuming, which is why I'm showing this bit on a time lapse. But you just have to keep gently sort of nibbling away and being patient. And that would be my next tip, really. If you're just starting out with portrait work, be really patient with yourself. And the cool thing is, though, if you work on portraits regularly, it will help every aspect of your art: landscape, still life, drawing people as a whole, drawing furniture, you name it. It's going to help you drawing animals, drawing skies, everything, because it's so difficult that if you can master portrait work, you're going to find the other stuff easier in comparison. So what I'm doing now is just generally, working on my tone and colours, adjusting the contrast here and there. I want the painting to pop, but I don't want it to be too harsh. So we're aiming for sort of a balance between character and impact, and a little bit of subtlety as well. I've still managed to maintain some of the pencil marks showing through, but you can see even at this late stage, having corrected that eye on the left, I'm now correcting it yet again. So I'm not afraid to kind of make mistake after mistake. I don't want to make all these mistakes, but if I make them, I will come back repeatedly and try to fix them. So there's the finished portrait. So there you can see the progression going from a human that looks a little bit like Rob, and then hopefully a finished painting, which I feel looks quite a lot like Rob Rinder. So there we go. That's that portrait demo complete. Hope you enjoyed the video. As always, please remember to like, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.